Welcome everyone to Woods Hole Historical Museum's virtual conversation, Pandemics, Living Forward by Understanding Backward. I'm Debbie Scanlon, Director of the museum. We're very pleased to have Dr. Donald Burke join us tonight. Dr. Burke received his medical training at Harvard Medical School, then served 23 years on active duty at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, where he led U.S. military research on virus diseases, including 6 years of research in Bangkok. In 1997, he transitioned to academia to become a professor and director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Immunization Research. In 2006, he became Dean of the Graduate School of Public Health at the University of Pittsburgh. Stepping down a year ago, he's currently a professor of epidemiology at Pitt. Throughout his career, he has led research on prevention and control of epidemic infectious diseases of global importance. A world-renowned expert on virus epidemiology, he has authored more than 300 scientific publications and has served in senior advisory positions to the CDC, NIH, and WHO. He's a member of the National Academy of Medicine and recipient of the John Snow Award of the American Public Health Association. Drawing on his deep knowledge of viral epidemiology, Dr. Burke first predicted the threat posed by coronaviruses in 1997, 5 years before the SARS epidemic. When Don and his wife, Jane, who happens to be my sister, came back to Woods Hole in June for the summer, I asked him where we were in this pandemic. He said the bottom of the second, and I must admit I was startled. Now I'm not sure where we are, but let's hope we don't go into extra innings. We're going to record this just so you know, and if you have questions, please put them in chat, and Don will answer them at the end of the talk. Welcome, Don. So glad to have you here.
Thanks, Deb. Glad to be able to do it. This is a good opportunity to have a chance to talk about something that's very important and something that I think that I've been working on for some time. Behind me, I have a background of a Franklin Gifford painting, and our house is on the property that he owned, Jane and Debbie's great-grandfather. So I'll get out of the way there a little bit. You can see it's Knobska, and there's a boat that's gone aground there. So let me share my screen here, and hopefully this will get us to where we want to go. Okay, is everybody seeing the introductory slide there? Can you hear me? Okay, good.
Yeah, good.
All right, good. So today I'll be speaking about pandemics, living forward by understanding backwards. The quote is one that I borrowed from the philosopher Søren Kierkegaard about the fact that when for us to move forward with an understanding of our circumstances, we need to study our past. I'll be talking first about the nature of pandemic viruses. I'll go into some about the 1918 influenza pandemic in Falmouth, talk about coronaviruses in general, not just the SARS-CoV-2. The problems that we have in predicting epidemic is more about predicting human behavior and then predicting the course of the epidemic, and leave time for discussion. By way of introduction, I want to make here's the diagram of the sizes of a human cell, a bacteria, and a virus. At the bottom of the slide is a tiny stripped down evolutionary machine. All it is just a few genes wrapped in some proteins and not much more. It's an evolutionary machine, and I'll come back to that theme. The word virus itself has changed over the years. in the original, virus meant a poison or a slimy liquid. That in turn changed over years to the 14th century, where it was a venomous substance. It wasn't until the 19th century that the words for contagious between viruses and bacteria meant that it was applied to the small eating microbes of the class that I showed. And the idea of any fast replicating as being viral, something viral, is a modern concept in the last few decades. But we're going to be using it mostly in the 20th century meaning. Over the course of the history of science, there have been many concepts about what causes contagious epidemics. That in the 1600s, the idea was that this was the will of God, and that here's a painting in Naples during the plague, which is a bacteria, not a virus, but it gives you the idea. And the reason I chose this one is that it shows the devastation, but more important, as you focus in on the epidemic and look at it in detail, one of the things that you notice is that people are wearing masks, and it's the essential workers, who are wearing the masks 400 years ago. As time went by, it wasn't until Louis Pasteur demonstrated that viruses were specific microbes that could be transmitted directly from individual to individual or from animal to animal, working on rabies and others. That in trying to understand what the nature of these microbes were, Bayernick passed the contagious fluids through filters that were really fine filters that got rid of everything except for the fluid. And there was nothing visible under the microscope, no bacteria, but they still transmitted the disease. And in this case, he was studying a virus of tobacco. And so he had the idea that these could be contagious fluids, that they weren't really particulate, or they were not microbial entities. Well, he wasn't right, of course, that they were just very small microbial entities. Wendell Stanley, in some of the first electron micrographs, showed that you could crystallize viruses. You could take some of these viruses and they would clump together and form small crystals, and you could observe those, showing that it really wasn't a fluid, but that it really was a substance of proteins, and that these would group together and you could even see the particulate nature. But it led to the important question: if these things were crystalline or particles, and they can replicate, but could they possibly be alive with that kind of character? And so that as a biological and philosophical question was an important one for several years. One of my heroes in this area is McFarland Burnett, a Nobel Prize winner who studied influenza, and he understood that viruses were this form of biological patterns. He said that viruses are not individual organisms in the ordinary sense, but something which could be called a stream of biological patterns. And I'll go into that a little bit more. I think it's a very modern concept of viruses as being interacting bits of information. In some ways, one of Napoleon's Surgeon Generals, Francois-Joseph Broussais, anticipated this idea that viruses could have their own intelligence or their own information processing capability when he referred to them as the génie de l'épidémie, the genius of the epidemic. And in his instance, there were sort of two uses of the term genie. One is the genie in the bottle, and the other one is genius. And they're ambiguous, at least as I understand the French. But that the notion that viruses can have this way of solving problems by evolving is an important one. And then Wolf, who discovered interferon, with a tongue-in-cheek, said that these debates really weren't helpful. That viruses should be considered as viruses because viruses are viruses. And he was, of course, mimicking Gertrude Stein's "A rose is a rose is a rose" in Sacred Emily. But the virus that has probably the most immediate impact in the 20th century was the 1918 influenza epidemic. And there are a lot of similarities between that epidemic. And so what I thought we would do is we would look back to that one so that we can look forward and try to understand the coronavirus epidemic a bit more. Debbie, helped me by calling attention to the record of diseases that were dangerous to public health here in Falmouth. And there's a record book that's kept over the years. And it's really interesting to go through what were the diseases that were present 100 years ago, or 102 years ago, during the 1918 influenza epidemic. And here's the book, and here's from the early parts of the year before, which is 1917, and the diseases there, that are listed there are diseases like tuberculosis and pertussis and measles and the common diseases. The names are listed there, where they live, and you'll see there's a column there that says treat and where people were from. Lots of these were from Woods Hole or from Quissit or different parts of Falmouth. And so every time there was a contagious disease in town, they would be registered in this book of dangerous diseases to public health. And this, as I say, was pre-1918 epidemic. There were epidemics of other things like pertussis or measles and the like. And so diseases would come and go, but for the most part, they would be small outbreaks at best. And then what happened was that in the October of 2018 or 1918, they had to add another column here where all of the cases are listed for influenza. And you can see them, the names there. Some of them there may be families you recognize, that a number of them are from East Falmouth or West Falmouth or Quissit and Woods Hole. And if you go through these books, you can find some really interesting history. This was written up a few months ago by the archives of the museum in Falmouth. We had an article entitled "Sneeze But Don't Scatter." And I recommend that you go back and read that article. It's an interesting review of what happened in 1918. I went through the books and tabulated. So here are the number of total cases of dangerous diseases in 1915, and July to December was 13. 1916, from January to December, the whole year, 45. 1917, 65. 1918 for the first almost months of the year, there were 65, and then the explosive epidemic of influenza when there were 529 cases of diseases, of which almost all of them were influenza cases, 523. The epidemic then tailed off into January and March of 1919, and then essentially disappeared by March, April of the 1919. Shown there are some of the photographs from the museum archives of one of the nurses visiting families during the influenza epidemic. I have gone back over the influenza epidemic of 1918, looked at the national data on the total mortality by week. And here is the curve of the number of deaths per week of the 1918 epidemic of influenza. It started in early mid-September, peaked by October, and was largely over by November. It really was very rapid. But there were a few waves that followed that. You can see the ups and downs that followed a wave in December, another wave in January. And this is the entire United States. So, but the epidemic wasn't uniform all across the US. So here are the largest cities of the United States and the course of the epidemic in each of these cities. And here are the cities, the East Coast cities like Boston and Cambridge and New York and Philadelphia were all in the first wave. Many of the cities in the Midwest were in the second wave. The cities that were in the more removed were in the further wave, and occasionally, then there were a few rebound waves after that. But the whole thing was done in a matter of months. But what it does remind us is that even in 1918, just like we're seeing now, that there were waves, that the East Coast had the first serious set of epidemics, and then subsequently in other parts of the country, the epidemic took hold. For instance, here's Baltimore, almost purely first wave. Denver had two humps. And in fact, this looks like, in many ways, looks like some of the coronavirus epidemics that we're seeing in Texas and Oklahoma and Missouri and other parts of the middle parts of the country. And if you look at, this is a map of the entire United States with wave one being the wave in the early part, wave two in December, wave three, January, and some of these late waves, wave four later. You see that in New England, it was all wave one, and then the rest of the country had subsequent waves as well. And again, I have to say, I'm really interested to see that the patterns look surprisingly like what we're starting to see right now. And I haven't seen a good analysis of the similarities and why. I'm sure it has something to do with population density, susceptibility as a function of population density, transit between cities and the like. And I think we need to work those mechanisms out. Let's go to Falmouth, and there were some other interesting similarities. So in Falmouth, there were discussions about what to do as the epidemic waxed and waned locally. That in that article on Untold Tales, I thought it was interesting that eventually the Board of Health and the school committee reopened some schools in Woods Hole and North Falmouth and West Falmouth, but delayed the opening of other schools in T-Ticket, East Falmouth, and Wacoit. And then by the end of February, everything was opened again, and the school year had to be extended. So there's some pretty strong parallels here, individual school districts making choices on their own. Another similar pattern in 1918 was that this was a mid-year election. It wasn't a presidential election, but it was in 1918. The first Tuesday in November was right in the middle of the epidemic. There was a reduction in the total number of voters. There's a nice article by Sarah Pruitt in the history website. And there were accusations of manipulation of the election, trying to influence who could hold rallies and who couldn't, and limiting the size. And some of those were said to be politically motivated. The West Coast, because it was a little later in the epidemic, was more affected than the East Coast. And one person in San Francisco referred to this as the first masked ballot ever known in the history of America. We may be heading into the second masked ballot in the history of America. There were consequences that in 1918, the Republicans gained power in the Congress. They blocked the US entry into Wilson's League of Nations, which doomed the League of Nations. If you want to read about the 1918 epidemic, one of the best books, not one of the best book, is by John Barry, called The Great Influenza. John's a friend. I had him come meet with my students. And then when I was dean at Pitt, we had him as our convocation speaker. I really enjoy talking to him. Well, the general idea of where viruses come from is that they essentially all start in animal reservoirs down on the bottom. And that if over time the viruses are circulating in animals, they jump the species barrier into a person. Sometimes that takes off, sometimes it doesn't, but it's got to move from a person to a village to a region to a world. And each of the pandemics does that. And so we can look at this a bit for comparing what happened in 1918 compared to what's happened currently for the coronavirus epidemic. This cartoon by Ed Kilborn in 1958 shows that there are lots of different types of influenza viruses that are designated by the hemagglutinin molecule that's on their surface, and those are given numbers, the hemagglutinin type 1, type 2, type 3, type, etc. Most of these are in waterfowl. They make it into pigs and horses, and so these are the animal species that can be the source of epidemics in humans. And the H1 was thought to come from pigs by way of ducks in 1918, the H2 epidemic in 1957, the H3, 68, and so on. I'll go into that in a little more detail. But the idea is there are lots of viruses out there circulating in animal species, and each of them mutating, solving its evolutionary problems, and occasionally doing that by jumping into a new host like humans. When the swine flu pandemic of 2009 occurred, one of my junior colleagues and I wrote a review for the New England Journal of Medicine on H1N1 viruses. And here's the way we diagrammed it for that article, that H1N1s are in this avian reservoir, that they've been there for a long, long time. And in 1918, they were in that reservoir, that the virus jumped into humans to create the 1918 epidemic, which then settled into a seasonal pattern. The seasonal pattern where flu occurred, H1N1, every year for the next 40 years, and then died out in 1957 when H2 occurred. There was an interval for 20 years where H1 viruses were gone from the human species, and then mysteriously it reappeared in 1977. The virus not only jumped into people at that time, so the question is, where was the virus during that time? Subject of another talk would be that I think there's a good chance that the virus was put into freezers in the 1950s and then taken out in 1976, and that it got back into humans through a potential lab accident. The virus not only jumped from birds into humans, it also jumped from birds into swine, and that in turn caused epidemics in pigs, particularly in North America, but in others parts of the world, major a little later. So the viruses are jumping into multiple species. And then also the virus, once it got into swine, jumped into people. There were sporadic cases. One of those cases occurred in 1976, where there was an epidemic at Fort Dix. It raised the concern that the H1N1 was going to come back. And that's probably why people went into their freezers to try to study H1N1s. The viruses also continued to jump into a new species and recombine with each other, reassort. and one of those led to the 2009 epidemic, which turned out not to be so bad, but it was nonetheless a significant new viral strain. So this, the fact that we have these emerging epidemics from time to time, the question that I and my colleagues have is, can we predict or prevent these epidemics in the future? We'd like to get ahead of the curve rather than be purely reactive. And the major epidemics that we know about, like AIDS and influenza, we know that AIDS has a non-human primate chimpanzee reservoir, that animal-human contact was responsible for how the virus, cross species, the virus recombines with itself and with other viruses really well. And it does that in nature, and that influenza does the same thing. And so there are some common features of the big emerging epidemics that were maybe give us a handle on how we could predict these things. In 1997, I gave a lecture at a American Society of Microbiology meeting. It was published in 1998. I gave a talk on evolvability of emerging viruses. And one of the subtopics in that talk was on predicting and preventing viral pandemics. And one of the, when I considered the different types of viruses that had these propensities of evolving, jumping species, having high animal reservoirs, I said that some of these viruses, particularly like the coronaviruses and the related viruses, should be considered serious threats to human health. These are viruses with high evolvability and proven ability to cause epidemics. At that point, coronaviruses were not known to be threats. They were known to be common cold viruses of no particular concern. And this was 5 years before SARS occurred. And so I got my 15 minutes of fame for having roughly called the idea that coronaviruses, like SARS virus, could emerge and cause problems. So now we can add to AIDS and influenza SARS as being another virus that has the same general patterns of having an animal reservoir, having human-to-animal contact, and a virus that evolves and recombines in nature. Well, I'll now move forward to our current epidemic in 2019. This is a family tree of coronaviruses. Each of the branches of this are a number of viruses found in different species of animals. They're all coronaviruses. They're all related to each other. And the ones that are circled in red there are the common cold coronaviruses that are on the family tree. They're all roughly related to each other. But the ones that are shown in the green circle and the purple circle are the SARS-CoV-2, the SARS-CoV, and another related virus that's the Middle East respiratory syndrome that's caused about 2,000 cases worldwide. Hasn't turned into a major pandemic. But these are all coronaviruses that are serious causes of pneumonia, disease, and death. And so they're starting to proliferate, starting to emerge. What the coronaviruses almost all have in common is that a major source for all of them are in bats. Here is the horseshoe-nosed bat that is thought to be the origin of the current coronavirus in Asia. This is my attempt to do like that Ed Kilborn diagram that I showed you of the influenza viruses, but here it's for the coronaviruses. And almost every species of mammal has its own coronaviruses that are circulating in them on a regular basis. And many of those, are thought to have a possible relationship to bat viruses. There are lots of bat coronaviruses. There are at least 91 different recognizable species of bat coronaviruses. And these are the ones that have jumped to cause the SARS-1, the SARS-2, and the MERS epidemics. So there is a big reservoir of SARS viruses out there that are jumping species. And it's probable that some of these viruses have jumped into humans in the past. Some of them have jumped, like in the bottom one there, from the bovine coronavirus is probably about 1890. And you can estimate that based on the evolutionary divergence of the cow virus and the human virus. There's an alpaca virus that's similar to one of the coronaviruses. So there's probably a lot of jumping going on historically. We just have never seen before, just because we didn't have the tools to recognize it. Now we're starting to recognize that coronaviruses do a lot of jumping across species. When the epidemic first started in China, in the Wuhan area, there was some concerns that it could spread, but probably the first major paper that got attention to this was by Neil Ferguson. Neil's a good friend and collaborator of mine. He's at Imperial College. We've been working together for years. And he published a paper in Nature that said, if just given what happened in China, and if we do nothing in the United Kingdom or in the United States, what would the course of the epidemic look like? This is not a prediction of what it would happen, but if we did nothing, how would it transmit and how many deaths would there be? And his estimate, which I think still is a legitimate estimate, is that without appropriate action, there'd be 500,000 deaths in the United Kingdom and over 2 million deaths in the United States. And as you may know, we're already at 200,000 deaths in the United States, and that's with a substantial effort to contain the virus. So I think that Neil was actually probably not far off in terms of estimating what the potential impact of the virus could be. A couple months later, after the epidemic had already started to peak and come down a bit, a group in Seattle at the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation looked at the curves, and they made some projections and said, well, because the curve's going down, that looks like we can project forward that it's going to go down and that the number of deaths will be manageable. And this was the preferred model by the White House at that time, that things were going to get better, and that this would be the course. But of course, that this presupposed that the efforts to control the virus would stay at the same level that they had been up until that point. So here we have now two different projections. One is the Imperial, saying that if we do nothing, it's going to go through the roof. And the other, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, which says that if we keep up the way we're going now on social distancing, the epidemic will be under control and manageable. And these are very, very different views of possible realities or future reality. So the challenge now is, how do you predict given these bounds? So we had the wave of coronavirus peaked in the spring, and as was asked by Mr. Scanlon a few minutes ago, have we reached herd immunity? That nationwide, the threshold for protection will be 50%. For New York, it'll probably be 75 or 80%. And we're currently still nationwide less than 10%. So we're still from seasonality is coronaviruses don't transmit as summer. So it's a good bet that the transmission will increase in the fall, that the natural seasonality will push it that way. There aren't any therapeutics or vaccines on the horizon. And the variables are going to be social distancing and compliance and contact tracing. And these are the wild cards. Can we predict how people are going to behave? What are going to be the responses to public health advice, or what are the other alternative pressures that will increase the epidemic? So here's the possible courses of the epidemic. One is that it will have ups and downs. As it turns out, we've already had a pretty major up in most of the country. Another would be that it just goes on like this for a while. Another is that we'll have an even bigger rebound in the fall. And so all of these are still in the range of things that could happen. Our current epidemic is different than this, so let's try again on our predictions. Let's see if we can do better this time around. So here are the new cases per day in the United States. Now going back to the January, the cases are shown as blue bars. The 7-day moving average of those cases is shown as the orange curve. We had the spring wave in April and May, and that started to decline, but then it took off again in June and July, and it's now starting to come down again. All right, so what's going to happen in the fall? What's going to happen over the rest of the year? The chances that we're going to have a vaccine are very slim that it will happen any time before the end of the year. I think anybody who has worked with vaccines knows how hard it is to not only make a vaccine, but then to produce it and get it out to everybody who needs it. I think it will be a minor miracle if that occurs before the middle of next calendar year. But so let's assume that's not going to happen before the end of the year. So what is going to happen? What are the possible future courses? I just drew these hand courses. A, meaning everything will go away and it will be under control. B, that will continue to have ups and downs. Or C, that will have a major wave sometime in the fall. And by sometime in the fall, I don't know exactly when that is, but that could be, let's say, October, November, December. Is that likely or not? And so I'm going to ask you all, what's your prediction? What do you think is going to happen? I'm curious to know what you think. And so let's do a poll here that you'll, coming up on your screen is a poll that allows you to say what you think is going to happen. So go ahead and vote what you think are, and we'll come back to this in a little bit. About what the majority of you think, and I have to say that your opinion now is going to be probably about as good as anybody else's in terms of predicting, because we have to predict the human behavior, not just the behavior of the virus. So why don't we? All right, as soon as you're ready to end the polling, you can, let's see, we were at 32 out of 42. Okay, we'll give it another minute or a couple seconds. Great. Okay, I'm going to go out and move forward. So let's look to see, some real world data on mobility and contact rates and how are we doing in terms of maintaining social distancing. Well, there are some really amazing ways of tracking how people are interacting with each other. And one of them is by tracking the movements of their mobile cell phones. Here's a graph of the, or here's a figure of the phones in towns, and that those of us that leave on our location services on our phone because we want to get the local weather, we want to get the local information, when you do that, that means your phone is trackable. And there of all the cell phones in the United States right now, which are over 100 million, that most of those are being tracked in terms of where they are at any given point in time. So you can get an idea how many cell phones stay home, how many go to Starbucks, how many go out in different parts of town, and you can track mobility. So here's a these data are from a company called SafeGraphs. That if you look at the different towns, if the baseline mobility of foot traffic, that is how many cell phones there are in the per square foot in these different cities that has moved out of their homes. The baseline stayed pretty constant until the 15th of March when we had all of the stay-at-home orders. Then gradually we've been increasing, and different cities have been increasing at different levels. Here's the data from Barnstable County that it shows on the bottom there, it shows the percent staying home. It was about cell phones, meaning people stay at home, was about 23%, and then it jumped up to 50%. Now it's gradually declining. And we're down, not back to baseline, but down to 31%. All right, so let's look at the results of the poll. We see that 11% said that it was curve A, 29% is curve B, and so most people are not terribly optimistic about what's going to happen in the fall, and I share that. I would vote for C too, but I have to say, as I freely confess, I'm pretty good at, I'm as good as they get at predicting viruses. I'm not very good at predicting humans. So there are a lot of these ongoing social factors, the economic pressures to reopen, isolation fatigue, recalibration of risk tolerance, meaning how many cases we don't care about. There's the whole issue of anti-science, and then the election factors are playing into this, where there's active disinformation and distrust of government, and just like was talked about in 1918, political advantage in the election, and then there's a potential for civil unrest at any time, just as occurred during the summertime. Well, if you're trying to be a predictor, Newton was pretty good at prediction. And this is a wonderful quote that he made in 1721. I can calculate the motions of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. And I wish I could say we were better at calculating or predicting what would happen with people. So let me conclude by saying that in the long term, I think it's fair to say that the SARS-CoV-2 is here to stay. It's going to be like other flus or like coronaviruses. Once you get into people, they stay. It's possible it'll evolve into a common cold virus, but eventually, it'll be under control. Shorter term is a harder prediction. I think that the easy part is predicting how the virus will behave. Predicting how humans will behave is going to be the hard part. And yet, that's critical. So if the humans adhere to sensible public health principles, the virus will be contained. If we don't, it won't. Josh Lederberg, who I think who discovered how DNA can change microbes, one of the smartest guys I ever met, was thought seriously about emerging infectious diseases. He wrote an op-ed in Science magazine 20 years ago, and I thought this was probably captured it about as well as anybody did. The future of humanity and microbes likely will unfold as episodes of a suspense thriller that could be titled Our Wits versus Their Genes. And I do think that's where we are right now, whether or not our wits are up to it or not. For your attention, and I will stop sharing my screen, and let's see if we can go back and go to questions and answers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. We have a couple questions. Recent cases, case decline, but testing is, so actual numbers may not be declining. How do we deal with such data?
Yeah, this has been a controversial for some time now. Correct cases. One of the things you can do is you can look at the historical rates of the percent positives and see how that's changing over time. And if that's going up, that's a matter of there are some indicators that can let you know virus transmission is heading in the right direction. The other thing is it's not the only thing to follow. You follow hospitalizations and deaths and other indicators of the epidemic.
Okay. Next question. The severity of the impact of the 1918 pandemic's toll primarily on the younger teens, 20-year-olds, and the impact is higher for the older and elderly.
No.
Explain it.
And I say nobody about the they wrote that young people, but now we've got a different virus, and it's harder to make a case that the elderly are having a more robust immune response. Everybody agrees that this is at least in part a disease of immune response. It isn't alone that kills you. It's the immune response that your body makes to the virus that contributes to the pathogenesis. But how you reconcile how that happened with one virus 18 among the young people and another virus in the older people in 20, I don't have a good explanation for that. I can give you lots of theories, but I don't have a proof explanation. Okay. And I don't think anybody does.
Okay, next question. 1918, 100 million in the USA, 200,000 died in October of this year, this virus. Antibiotics for pneumonia. The economy survived and we won World War I. I'm not sure I know what the question is here.
Yeah, there's a kernel of an important point there is that did we shut down the economy in 1918 or not? The answer, we didn't shut down the whole economy, but we did shut down schools. We did limit social distancing. We shut down theaters. We shut down group gatherings. There were a lot that were done to limit human-to-human contact. One of the things we didn't do is shut down the economy. We were still at the end of a war time that the epidemic, half of the deaths in the United States were in military, of people who ended up with deaths from the pneumonia from the influenza epidemic. It was a serious problem for the military as well. So it was a different time. People had our life expectancy in the U.S. was 50, 55 years old. We tolerated death a lot more as part of than we do now. So there are different which is the best approach? Is it better to try a number of deaths? As I pointed out by Neil, if we do nothing, we can make a good guess that we're going to have on the ballpark of 2 million deaths. To me, I think that's too many.
Okay, next question. If this is with us for decades, will it continue to be as deadly for vulnerable people as it is today?
Don't know for sure. My guess, probably not, but I know that. The situations where emerging diseases have studied over time and what pathogenicity, that is, what their deadliness was if you have an infection. So two measures are how transmissible is it? Are you going to get infected or not? And the other one is if you get infected, likely to die. These are not necessarily related to each. And oftentimes for infectious diseases, the transmissibility will increase, because the virus that is successful in transmitting will propagate itself. But from a point of view, from the microbe's point of view, it really doesn't do any advantage to the microbe to kill you. If anything, they want the microbe does as well in sick people. So I don't know. My guess is that if there's going to evolve anyway, it's probably going to evolve toward lower pathogenicity, but this is a guess.
Okay. Next question, is it possible to get the seasonal flu concurrently with COVID-19? That's a question I've been hearing too, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's going to be possible. I don't know any reason why it won't be. The other thing it's going to be hard to tell which it is. So if somebody has symptomatic disease of, low-grade fever or cough, if you look at the symptoms and signs of the corona lot, there are a few that differentiate, but they really are not enough for a doctor to say, yes, you have this, or yes, you have that. So it's kind of confusion. The rapid diagnostics will be important for both flu and coronavirus to get
Go
it.
out and get our flu shot.
Yeah, I think that it would. Yeah, it's important every year to have a flu shot, but there's even more reason to have it this year.
Okay. Next one, is asymptomatic illness a characteristic of the 1918 flu?
That it's thought, particularly among children, maybe 50% of the flus were symptomatic. The adults there was a fair amount on COVID-19 to be able to draw a direct comparison. Nor to, by the way, I should that in 18 epidemic or techniques, there was no to know who was infected, unlike, and so trying to be able to count symptomatic infections with the micro tools at the time was essentially impossible. So, most of the answers to that are going to be speculative.
Okay, next question is, anyone looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on in utero and early childhood development?
I don't know those data myself. I have friends who are pediatricians. One of the things that happened was early on in this epidemic, that there are very, very few children, young children who are infected. Just in the last month or two, we've started to see more young children be infected. In my lab, so I know the numbers there best. Now a number of kids under, who were diagnosed as having COVID infection, and what we were trying to figure out is in kids who are less than 1, how many of those are months to 12 months, and did they get infected from mom in utero, or did they get infected from siblings, or the initial thoughts were kids don't get infected, and it's not a problem. That's being revisited right now.
Okay, the next one is about the economy. The best economy in the world was shut down for a virus that doesn't kill infants or healthy people. It kills elderly, sick, and obese people. We have a serious obesity epidemic and an infectious virus, which is not really virus, and 350,000 Americans compared to 103 million in 1918. The disparity between 1918 and 2020 is stunning in terms of virulence and destruction of livelihoods. I guess the question is, yes, why was the economy being shut down? Is that worth?
Yeah, that's the same answer. We don't, and it's not bringing down the economy. It's a question of how do you assess and how do you balance enough of the decal that you lower the test. If we did nothing, I will stand by the number expected. So to count totals at this point and say that that this one isn't as bad as the other ones, I don't think is quite a legitimate. But it is a fair question: is the social value of shutting down schools, stopping education, there are all sorts of negative fallouts of closing the economy, and how do we balance those? And I don't think it's an either or. I think what we really do, we need to social distance just enough to keep the virus from getting out of control. And everybody's trying to do that right now. And everybody shut down, more than was necessary immediately, which is great because it really did stop the transmission. But now, we're loosening up gradually and trying. Each place is finding out, how much loosening we can do without letting this get out. If this were a forest fire, again, if this were, we're only 10 or 15% of the population has been infected. That means it's a forest where only 10% of the trees have been burned. And so you've got 90% of this to turn into a raging fire still. And so to try to say, no, we'll scale back now because we're not worried about that, I think could lead to potential disaster.
Okay, next, can you speak to the transmissibility and time course of infectivity, asymptomatic versus, pre-symptomatic?
Yeah, I can speak to it, but I'll do it with broad brush. Is that there's a fair amount of transmissibility by asymptomatics. There's a fair amount of transmissibility by pre-symptomatics. If you try to figure out, what is the total transmission from each of those groups, I'd say that there's more transmission from persons with symptoms than not without symptoms. But it's been, this is a problem for the COVID, is that asymptomatic transmission is real, pre-symptomatic transmission is real. We're doing computational modeling and we're trying to put numbers on these ratios right now, which nobody's got them. We can make our best guesses on those, but nobody's got solid numbers yet.
Okay, next question. Are you comfortable dining inside a restaurant?
No. For any place that is a confined space right now, I'm not comfortable in any confined space. And I just, I think it's okay outdoors. I think, and I'm going to wear a mask. When I go into places, I wear a mask, and I'm pretty careful about it. But people can make their own choices about what their own risk tolerance is. The other thing is that Massachusetts is doing pretty well right now. The total infection rate is pretty low. If you want to go out to a restaurant, we've been ordering in restaurants. We got a lot of our favorite restaurants around town, and we're doing everything we can to support them by ordering out, so that they stay alive. But we don't have to go inside. We'd rather if we could, but there's, given the choices, and I don't want to do that.
Next question. Do you think that mortality is just the tip of the iceberg and the greater impact could be long-term morbidity?
Yeah, that's an open question that is starting to be thought about a lot more now. That it looks like there's a fair number of these slow COVIDs that are where the disease burns out over months, and that people don't rid themselves of the virus for months, and that there are consequences for a long time. So and we also don't know. These are the overt clinical cases right now. Are there going to be more cases of blood vessel disease or heart disease? Since a lot of what's going on in should be worried about that.
Next question. Indoors or outdoors, might the infection rate be heavier for the elderly? Be partly because of more indoor life as well as immune response. Indoor kids more apt to get the virus?
Yeah, I do think that who you interact with, and if you're indoors all the time in congregate settings, those are risky settings, and it isn't just the elderly. It's people that are in jails or any other place where there are a lot of people who are crowded together indoors for long periods of time without outdoor ventilation. So yes, that's part of it. But and it's probable that if you become infected and you're elderly, it's probably worse for you as well.
Okay. Any more questions? Okay. Well, if you do, just email me and I will send them on to Dr. Don. But thank you all. This has been really informative, and thank you, Don, so much. This has really been great. And
Great. Thanks for the opportunity.
okay, thanks all.